Well, I grew up on a farm in Nebraska, and it was fascinating when spring was starting to kind of be on the horizon, because after all the cold and wind and ice and snow and, did I mention cold? It was something really welcome to have a little bit of promise of spring, of warmth and all that. You didn't really realize how tense you were until the warm came and you started to kind of relax a little bit. And when you stepped outside, you weren't all bundled up. There's a little bit of promise there of that warmth to come. I remember the earth would be starting to change. The ground was starting to thaw. I know we don't have frozen ground here, but back in the Midwest, yeah, there's frozen ground. And it doesn't just thaw nicely, it turns into this cold, muddy stuff for a while. And but that's not all bad, because the greenness starts to return to the land. The grasslands will start to have some grass growing, some greenness there. There are daffodils starting to grow. Then there are all those other little yellow flowers that start to grow, those little beautiful round things that everybody thinks is a plague, but they're kind of pretty. It's this return of spring that kind of has all the gardeners and the farmers and all those people that are interested in that starting to think about planting again, planting seeds in the ground. My dad, first thing he would do is he would be planting oats. You know, the stuff you make oatmeal out of, that stuff. Sometimes I have to translate a little bit. Anyway, we would do it with there's a wagon, and then Dad had this contraption in the back of the wagon that had a kind of a hopper on it and had little fan propeller kind of things in there. My job was to be in the wagon and put the oats into this hopper, and then it would just fling it out all over the place. I'm sure all of you have been in that situation. And then we would plant corn, and it's amazing how precise you had to be with planting corn. Corn had to be planted in exactly perfectly straight rows, otherwise it wouldn't grow. God never did figure that out. God just plants all over the place. Well, this is also the time that the gardeners start thinking about what's the first things that you can get out there. You can get your lettuce and radishes out there and all those kind of things out there. It's a little early for the tomatoes and all that. But this energy is starting to build. And it's all based on this one little, well, more than one, but this little seed. This little dry seed that has to be planted in the ground. The poor thing has to be buried before anything will happen. If you leave one of these dry seeds up on top of the ground, not much happens. But if you push it into the ground, the moisture there starts to swell this seed, and pretty soon it kind of picks up a life of its own, and a shoot comes out of there, and you have this wonderful plant growing. It always amazes me how that little seed with that shoot, the shoot can always figure out which end is up. Did you ever think about that? Or maybe these things only bother me, It's one of these things that if you're into that farming and gardening and all this, no matter how much you get into it, it's a fascinating process to put something in the ground and then see this plant come up and grow, and then you get all the produce off of that. The other thing I'm always amazed at is how God can pack that whole plant in that little seed. Do you ever wonder how God does that? Must be really some good packaging, to get that done. But that's our God. Our God does those kind of things. Our God always has that promise of life floating around there. Well, our lesson today is about many things, but there's a piece of it that Jesus says something close to the fact that the grain must fall on the ground and die. And that's always fascinated me, because almost every farmer gardener knows that when you put the seed in the ground, the seed is not dead. It never dies. Well, sometimes, but there's always that promise of life there. That promise of life when you put it into the ground, that it will grow and make this wonderful plant. So I think maybe, just maybe, John, the book of John, is telling us maybe that's part of our life too. We have that promise of life also. That promise of life that God has given to us. Our God is indeed a God of life, not death. How can I say that? Well, just look around you in the world. From the tops of the mountains to the bottoms of the sea, there's all kinds of life there. You can go to the coldest parts of the world in Nebraska and Michigan and Antarctica and those places, and then go to the jungles of Central America or South America, and there's life, just abundant life all over the place. Our God is a God of life. So is it any surprise that Jesus rose from the dead? It should not be to us. The disciples, well, they were kind of maybe missing the point. Because when things really got bad for them, they scurried off and hid as far away from the trouble that they could. Even the women that came to the tomb that first Easter morning. Why were they coming to the tomb? Because they were bringing spices and all kinds of things for a dead Jesus. They were all surprised by what happened. It should not have been a surprise to them. That promise of life was there in Jesus the whole time. And he even told them what was going to happen. That the Son of Man must suffer from the priests and all of this, and then rise to new life on the third day. He told them. But somehow they just could not handle that. They missed that completely. So, if God is the one that has given us life and sustains us in our life and raises us up from death every day out of our sin to new life in God, then indeed we have that promise of life that will be forever. This life, the next life, that promise of life will always be there for us in Jesus Christ. So we're a little bit like that seed. You know, that little dry seed has that promise of life within it, to burst forth into this new, beautiful plant of whatever it will be. We have that promise of life within us that's going to be bursting forth every day into new life in Jesus Christ. That was kind of interesting. When you put a seed in the ground, what do? You have to water it, right? So we just happen to have a part of who we are that includes water. So we actually get watered, and then we can burst forth with that promise of life it is given to us. So we have this, we're growing. What kind of fruit will we produce? It's always interesting. Well, the fruit that we would produce might be, well, let's call it being gardeners or farmers and planting seeds, planting that seed of Christ in other people. As amazing as the process is to plant a seed and watch it grow into something spectacular, it's even more spectacular to plant that seed of Christ in someone. A tiny seed that will grow. And then watch this person grow into something beautiful. So, in essence, we have that promise of life. And it's our job to plant that seed, that promise of life, in everyone that we meet. Amen.